In this lecture, we're going to do a general overview of the theories of crime. Now, we've always had crime among us, and there have been explanations for why people do the things they do from the dawn of time. Traditional explanations, however, focused on spiritual or natural explanations. They were rooted in religious beliefs and superstitions. So, for example, crime was against nature or the natural order. Um, Traditional people believed that life was an ongoing war between good and evil, and criminals then succumbed to the evil. And even victims themselves weren't blameless. So, for example, victims are often thought of receiving retribution for something they did in the past, sort of like karma, if you want to kind of get a more modern explanation. And in fact, victims were often receiving some divine retribution for something they did in the past. The belief at that time, of course, had to do with evil, crime, uh, and always focusing on the individual behavior. So the person themselves was evil. The victim deserved what they received, and so there was sort of a natural balance in the world. Also, another way in which someone could become criminal is, of course, with demonic possession. So that it wasn't really them, it was some kind of force outside of them that possessed them and did this. Well, if you believe that crime is sort of based on some spiritual or evil or whatever, one of the best ways to put people through a test in order to determine guilt or innocence is a trial by ordeal. What that means basically is the best way to test someone's guilt, if it's divine, is to put them through the test. And if they're innocent, God will save them. So you had these ordeals that people would be put through to test their innocence. For example, in this picture right here, you take the suspect and you dunk them into the river and leave them underwater for 5-10 minutes, and then you pull them out. If they're dead, that means they were guilty. And if they're alive, it means they're not guilty because God saved them. Or you might ask somebody to walk around with a red hot poker. If their hands burned, then they were guilty. And if their hands didn't burn, then they were not guilty. As you might guess, there were very few innocent people back then. Certainly most people dunked in the water came up dead, and most people carrying those rods would be burned. So fast forward, there were not real developed theories of crime and criminality until about the 18th century. There was a movement in Europe and in American philosophy um, to look at crime in a different way. And of course, this is the classical school. The classical school came out of a period of enlightenment. There was optimism in the world. There was a sense of the good that humans could be. So there was optimism. You had philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau that were talking about people being a tabula rasa, or the potential of humankind. But this enlightenment was also tempered by a realistic recognition of the sad state of human affairs at that time, and that there was a need for major reforms. In the classical form, it was thought that crime came as a result of evil or moral wrongdoing fed by personal choice. In other words, the criminal chooses to do wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have other ideas about what might make someone choose to do wrong, but you have to understand that as a central part of their belief and their philosophy is our belief in free will. And so the principle of free will then is a really important part to deciding to become a criminal. And they believed that there were some specific inherent rights and wrongs in the world. So there are things that we could all identify and say, this is right and this is wrong. So the human condition, although they understood that it had problems, we are inherently good unless we choose to do wrong. So what are some of the other major principles of the classical school? Well, the classical school also talked about what society provides to individuals. If humans are essentially good, what does our culture or society do for us? Well, it provides us benefits. And whether it's the economy, you have a hierarchy, you have a place. So society provides the individual benefits. But in return, society requires the forfeiture of some individual benefits. In other words, in order to live harmoniously together, your desire to run around nude in the streets might interfere with someone else's rights not to see you naked. So the idea is that society requires you to do certain things as well. And according to the classical school, crime damages the bond between the individual and the society. So this is, you have certain rights as an individual, certain benefits that society gives you, and in return, society requires some behavior from you. But when you commit a crime, you damage the bond between yourself and your society. Okay, those are the major tenets of the classical school. There are two people that are very much associated with the classical school, Cesare Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham. And they are two philosophers that had a huge impact on our views of criminality. They each wrote a book. As you can look at the dates of those books and think about what's going on in history at about this time. This is 1764. Beccaria's essay on crimes and punishments was published. And then 1789, Bentham's Introduction to the Principles of Moral Legislation was published, and they were widely read. So the major proposals from these two classical theorists was that punishment needed to be swift. In order to have the greatest deterrence, you should have the punishment come soon after the discretion, the crime. They also argued that there's no justification for severe punishment. So cruel punishment, there is no justification for. That people cannot respond to cruel punishment and it doesn't teach them anything. Also, they argued that punishment should fit the crime. So the more severe the crime, the more severe the punishment should be. And if it was a small discretion, then it should be a small punishment. They also argued that people needed to be treated with due process. People needed to know what the process was when they are accused of a crime. There has to be a process in place. People need to know what it is. And if they know it, they're more likely to follow the law. And then finally, you can't have law if people don't know what the law is. So the law should be widely known. So these were the major principles that you saw from Beccaria and Bentham. And if you looked at the dates that those books were published in, think about what was going on in our country at that time. At that time, we're going to assert our independence from England, and the Revolutionary War will come about. And the framers of our Constitution were fully aware of the work of Beccaria and Bentham. And in fact, many of our Bill of Rights come directly from the classical school of criminology. So for example, the right to a public trial is something that both Beccaria and Bentham talked about extensively. The right to be judged by peers, our jury system, again, greatly influenced by the classical criminologists. The right against unusual or cruel punishments, again, right there in our Bill of Rights. And the right to a speedy trial, all come from these classical criminologists. So you could say that the U.S. Constitution and our Bill of Rights was heavily influenced by the classical school. So about 100 years later, another school of thought came into vogue, and this was called the Positivist school. The Positivist school was one of the main pushes was to use scientific techniques to study crime, which can sound really good and really like a positive move. However, if you really think about our scientific methods at the time, they were pretty crude. And some of the theories that our positivists came up with were don't hold a lot of sway today. However, the intention was good, to use science to try to study crime. The positivists believe that behavior, and especially criminality, is a function of two things. One is external forces that are beyond the control of the individual, and then internal forces such as our mental capabilities and biological makeup. So those are the two main pieces of their theory. It sounds pretty good in in theory, but in practice, there were some pretty unusual and distasteful kinds of theorists that sprang from the positivist school. So think about exactly what the positivists are saying. While the classical folks were talking about free will and your decision, if you look at the positivist school, really the individual doesn't have a whole lot of control over his or her own behavior. Your biology is what you were born with, and then there are external forces that you have absolutely no control of. It takes away the free will of the criminal. So let's take a look at one positivist theorist, um, and that is Cesare Lombroso. He's probably one of the more famous. He was an Italian criminologist, and he was a founder of the Italian School of Positive Criminology. He was influenced um, by three people. Darwin, as you know, was talking about social selection and evolution. Lavater, who out of those three names, you probably recognize Lavater, Darwin, and not the other two, and that's because only Darwin's theory really has survived the test of time. Lavater was studied physiognomy, which is the study of the theory of the idea is that you assess a person's outer appearance, primarily their face, in order to determine something about their inner character. So in other words, by looking at somebody's face and their facial features, I can tell something about you, your personality, and whether you're likely to be a criminal, for example. And then, of course, Francis Gall. Francis Gall's proposed a theory of phrenology, where basically he suggested that the shape of someone's head and the bumps and fissures on one's skull, he would massage people's heads and find the bumps and fissures, and basically he could map out your personality traits and criminality based on your skull. So you can see Lombroso's using these three very sort of biologically based theorists to discuss criminality. And in 1861, he wrote a very influential paper called On Criminal Man, in which he discussed his ideas. So what did he suggest? What he suggested was you can recognize a criminal because they have a unique physical type. And he suggested that there were four kinds of criminals. The first type is what he calls atavisms. And these are the criminals that he spent most of his time studying because, according to him, these were the criminals that you could spot by looking at facial features. These were, as Lombroso called, evolutionary degenerates. Look at the terminology that's being used here. This is not somebody who made a mistake. This is not someone who, because of certain reasons, chose to commit a crime but can be rehabilitated. We're talking about someone who, by evolutionary standards, is a degenerate. Okay? The other type of criminal was the insane. Again, this is the type of criminal where the mental illness causes the criminality. Then there was, Lombroso gave sort of a hand wave to what he calls the occasional criminal. And this is the person who occasionally commits crime for some kind of personal gain. And although he did a little bit of hand waving about this person, he didn't really do much about it. And then finally he talked about the passionate criminal. And this is the person who is pushed by passion to do something that they don't usually do. So because of something that happened, your passions were inflamed, your anger was inflamed, and you commit a crime. So here you have a very different way of looking at criminality that you saw from the classical school. The positivist school gave rise to some of the very interesting and maybe some disturbing biological theories that came about in the 19th and 20th century, or yes, I would say the late 19th and early 20th century. And we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about those theories because they're all biological nature. So what I'm going to do is record a separate lecture that talks about some of the biological theories. I just wanted to introduce you to these two big schools within criminology, the classical and the positivist school, and to show you how differently they view human beings. Okay? Oh, by the way, these, oops, these are the pictures of the evolutionary degenerates that were in Lombroso's book. And as you can tell, these are kind of unusual looking characters. Certainly, if you saw them walking down the street, you might go to the other side of the street.